Hello and welcome back to our special coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine after the just concluded presidential and National Assembly elections in Nigeria. We look forward to sharing your mornings with you from here on. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz advises Russia must make the first move towards peace by withdrawing its troops from Ukraine. China and Belarus call for an end to Ukraine's conflict at a meeting in Beijing. Plus, Finland starts construction on Russia border fence. Let's begin with the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who says it's up to Russia to make a move towards peace in Ukraine, and Moscow must withdraw its troops. Speaking alongside the visiting Latvian Prime Minister, he also told reporters that if attacked, NATO will defend every single square centimeter of its territory.
Russia attacked Ukraine, and Russia is the country which must take a step now and do something so that peace becomes possible. What's necessary is a withdrawal of troops. As allies, we agree, in case of an attack, we will together defend every single square centimeter of NATO's territory. I mean it, just the way I'm saying it. That message is also very important to me in regard to our friends in the Baltics and in Poland.
Once the hostilities end, Latvia is convinced that Ukraine also needs to move in NATO's direction, with the express intent to make sure that once this war ends, and eventually it will, this year, next year, maybe in a few years, but that such an aggression from Russia's side could never happen there, as it cannot happen now in the rest of NATO. So this is a direction that we feel strongly that we should be looking at. The challenge that we all face collectively in Latvia, in Germany, in France, in the UK, in the US, is to make sure that our societies understand that this is not a short-term event. This is not for the spring season. This is potentially for many years to come, where we will have to readapt our militaries, our military industry, to be able to step up to a much, much bigger challenge.
And Polish Climate Minister Anna Moskwa says democratic countries worldwide should make Russia pay war reparations to Ukraine and cut all financial aid and economic ties with it. Moskwa says that democratic states must learn a lesson from Russia's war in Ukraine in 2014, after which she said they continued business as usual with the Russian Federation. The meeting of the Partnership for Transatlantic Energy and Climate Cooperation, PTAC, gathered government officials and private investors from the United States and Europe to discuss how to help Ukraine rebuild its energy grid and switch to clean energy.
The U.S. believes public-private partnerships are critical to combat the global climate crisis. We'll depend heavily on the innovation, the dynamism of our private sector. It's critical that we work with the private sector to develop and deploy cutting-edge technologies to decarbonize every facet of our economy. This can't be done by government alone. It requires the partnership, the engagement of industry.
We are living in a world where, again, energy is a weapon. But London, as we all know, weapons can be tools too. And that's the transformation that we need to have. That weapon that has been laid bare during this last year can be a tool. It's a tool for integration, for better collaboration, and I think the transatlantic partnership is a shining example of that.
We need to get Ukraine compensated from Russian Federation as much as possible and over. It should be decent compensation for everything, for energy, for energy infrastructure, for every single human being, for environment, for whatever what was destroyed and affected. And
CE's overall mission of financing and risk management tools to help us realize this.
We also understand that the renewables is the quick answer, which should be realized as quickly as we can, because that is the issue of decentralization. So we achieve this goal if we let's say install more renewables. And from the other side, that is also very important from the military threats, that it's very difficult, even from let's say military targets, to target so many stations renewables if they are all around the country. In the future, in fact, we see the mix of generation in Ukraine that is half nuclear and half renewables.
Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky says forces are keeping all sections of the front under control. The president said that cities on the front line were being shelled by Russia in deliberate terror. During his nightly address, President Zelensky says that every Ukrainian had felt the difficulty of providing energy through the harsh winter.
Фронтовий напрямок тримаємо під контролем.
We are keeping each sector of the front under control. There were reports on this situation during the day from the military units of Khortytsia, Tavria, Odessa, North. In addition to the directions of the front, attention is also paid to the frontline territories, to those cities and districts that are under Russia's shelling every day and night, under deliberate terror. Nikopol and other communities of the region, Zaporizhzhia, Kherson, and the region, the frontline part of Donbass, Kharkiv, Sumy region, Chernihiv region.
Енергією і теплом. Так, загроза для енергосистеми зберігається, але
The winter is over. It was very...
The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian military might pull back troops from the key stronghold of Bakhmut. That's according to Alexander Rodnyatsky, an advisor to Ukraine's president, in remarks that suggest Russia could capture the city that has become a symbol of Ukrainian resistance. The Kremlin forces have waged a bloody, months-long defensive to take Bakhmut. Now, the battle for Bakhmut has come to embody Ukraine's determination as the city's defenders hold out against relentless shelling and Russian troops suffer heavy casualties. Bakhmut lies in Donetsk province, one of the 4 provinces Russia illegally annexed last fall. China President Xi Jinping and his Belarusian counterpart Alexander Lukashenko have called for a ceasefire and negotiations to bring about a political settlement to the Ukraine conflict at talks in Beijing. The 2 leaders issued a joint statement in which they expressed deep concern about the development of the armed conflict in the European region and extreme interest in the soonest possible establishment of peace in Ukraine. The statement also adds that Belarus and China are interested in averting an escalation of the crisis and ready to make efforts to restore regional peace and order. Beijing has become increasingly vocal in calling for peace as the Ukraine conflict rages on and denies it will provide arms to Moscow after U.S. officials said China was considering doing so. Meanwhile, the president of China also held talks with the visiting Belarusian president in Beijing. He also said that the 2 sides announced in Samarkand last September to upgrade China-Belarus relations to an all-weather, comprehensive strategic partnership which has injected strong impetus to bilateral cooperation in all fields. He adds that China's high-quality development and modernization will bring new opportunities to Belarus and other countries in the world. The Chinese president stressed that both sides should enhance political mutual trust and remain each other's true friends and good partners. He calls on the 2 sides to firmly support each other's choice of the development path, support each other in safeguarding their core interests, opposing external interference in their internal affairs, and safeguard their sovereignty and political security. Now let's take a look at Finland, who've started construction work on a pilot of the eastern border the barrier fence that it plans to build along parts of the country's border with Russia. The construction of the pilot fence of approximately 3 kilometers started on both sides of the Imatra border crossing point, which work on the terrain, clearing the forest. Now, in November last year, Finland's government proposed spending 139 million euros to build fences along parts of the country's border with Russia, fulfilling a promise made in the wake of Moscow's February invasion of Ukraine. Finland, which is applying for membership in the Western military alliance NATO, has a history of wars with Russia. Uranium particles enriched to near bomb-grade levels have been found at an Iranian nuclear facility, according to the UN's nuclear watchdog, as the U.S. warned that Tehran's ability to build a nuclear bomb was accelerating. According to reports, the Vienna-based International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed that uranium particles enriched to 83.7% purity, which is close to the 90% enrichment levels needed to make a nuclear bomb, have been found in Iran's Fordow fuel enrichment plants, an underground nuclear facility located some 20 miles northeast of the city of Qom. The report says that in January, the IAEA took environmental samples of the Fordow plant, which showed the presence of high enriched uranium particles of up to 83.7% purity. The IAEA subsequently informed Iran that these findings were inconsistent with the level of enrichment of the Fordow plant as declared by Iran, and requested Iran to clarify the origins of these particles. The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov held talks with his Indian counterpart a day before attending the G20 foreign ministers meeting in India, which has kept a largely neutral stance on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. India has declined to blame Russia for the war, seeking a diplomatic solution and sharply boosting its purchases of Russian oil. Besides meeting Indian Foreign Minister, Lavrov also held talks with counterparts from Turkey, South Africa, and Brazil. That's according to a senior Indian diplomat overseeing diplomatic engagements on the sidelines of the G20 meeting. Lavrov assessed the current security situation in the context of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and ironed out issues on the use of local currencies for settling trade during the hour-long meeting with Jay Shankar. Now let's talk to security expert Mr. Chidi Wanu, who joins us virtually from London. It's good to have you on the show this morning.
Good morning.
Let's begin with a comment from the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who says Russia is making, a move towards peace in Ukraine, and Moscow must withdraw its troops. He also says that if attacked, NATO will defend every single territory. What do you make of this statement?
Well, it's at this point, it's a fairly boilerplate statement that you're going to get from any official. I mean, the interesting part is obviously the assertion that Russia is trying to make peace moves. We're not quite sure what those peace moves are, and there's nothing physical or operational that you're seeing on the ground. I mean, the Russians are still continuing their attacks on infrastructure and their attacks on Ukrainian positions, and their rhetoric has not shifted. There is obviously the Chinese peace plan, as it were, that's being bandied about, but I think that there's no party, the Chinese included, who take that seriously. But if you're looking at it in the wider scheme of things, it can be taken as an attempt to at least start some sort of a third-party intervention. But beyond that, Olaf Scholz's statement should just be taken as, restating the obvious, that the Russians need to withdraw, and there has to be some form of negotiation. And then again, because Germany has come under a lot of criticism, a lot of it quite unfair, about its support for Ukraine. This again is another way of Olaf Scholz kind of making sure that everyone understands that their position is fundamentally with the Ukraine and with the Ukrainian kind of side, and also with NATO.
Now, can you clarify further, because Russia has never made any pretension, although people have alluded to this, of trying to annex territories aside from Ukraine, add to its territory, become this juggernaut of war that goes around taking people's land, which some people say is an insidious motive at the end of the day behind this situation. They cite Crimea, they cite Ukraine now, but Russia has never said so. Do you think that this is helpful for mediation efforts going forward?
Well, no. I mean, there's clearly, if you're going to negotiate with somebody or to end a war, and while you're doing that, you're holding referendums on their territory and claiming it as yours for, for eternity, and stating that your borders end where you say they end. It's not an incentive for them to make peace unless, again, very clearly, unless you are winning so overwhelmingly on the battlefields that they make peace out of fear. Now, it is clear that the Russians are not winning overwhelmingly on the battlefield. Both sides are doing a lot of damage to themselves. So it's more just, again, depending how deep we want to go into this, this is the standard Russian way of war, in that it will move into a territory and eventually it will claim it as its own. That's how the Russian Empire grew from Moscow and, started in Kiev, but grew from Moscow to Russia that we know today, into a huge multi-ethnic empire spanning multiple time zones. And it's the same way that the Soviet Union expanded after the Second World War, moving from Russia's or the Soviet Union's borders into Poland, Hungary, etc., and forming the Warsaw Pact and that communist bloc. So there's nothing particularly unique about it. This is the standard Russian way of war. What's interesting is that normally Russia does this from a position of strength. They do it when they've achieved battlefield victory. What's curious is them doing it while that battlefield victory is not assured, and it's curious. Essentially, it could either indicate that there is a deep confidence within their actions, or it could indicate there is a deep insecurity in their actions, in that they're jumping straight to the finish without having done the work to build up.
Now, to the Polish climate minister, Anna Moskwa, who says that Russia shall make, that countries shall make Russia pay reparations for the war. Now, it sounds fine and dandy when you're speaking on that kind of platform, but how realistic is this, or is this just building castles in the sky?
It is building castles in the sky, because, I mean, the only way you pay reparations is if you're completely defeated and you're compelled to some sort of an unconditional, peace deal. It is very unlikely in this case Russia can ever be unconditionally defeated. They can be defeated in the battlefield, so they can be pushed out of Ukraine, they can be pushed out of Crimea with, serious casualties on both sides. But to be defeated to the point where, they're going to voluntarily pay reparations is unlikely. I mean, at that point, your capital is surrounded and, or your entire army is defeated. And clearly, once the Ukrainians cross, if the Ukrainians cross into Russia proper and not, annexed Ukrainian terrain, then that's, an invasion of Russia, and Russia will clearly use nuclear weapons. So it's just never going to happen. But the caveat to that is that there's a significant amount of Russian assets that have been seized in the West, which could be taken and used to compensate Ukraine. And I think there is a very strong probability that that is what's going to happen at the conclusion of this war. It's a very strong negotiating piece for the West and for the Ukrainians when this war comes to an end. But that Russia would voluntarily pay reparations is completely unlikely.
Mr. Wano, you made reference in my last question, but one of the historical antecedents of Russia concerning waging war and how it adds territories to its territory. Let's take a look at the motives now, keeping in mind the criticism of Russia, and try and be factual and fair. Do you think that, because people have drawn comparisons in this war to, God forbid, if it escalates, a third world war involving other countries, which is why the West has also been careful and treading lightly as far as being involved is concerned, and in sending weapons and engaging in air conflict, that is fighting from the skies and using the Air Force concerning Russia. Do you think that Putin has any such thing in his mind? Remember in the days of Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany and his claims of superiority of the Aryan race and what have you. And therefore, he wanted to, and he did all those horrible things that he did. Do you think there's any such thing, as far as Russia is concerned, down the road, if things don't get better but get worse?
Well, It's a difficult question to answer, mainly because any analyst who will sit here and tell you he knows what Vladimir Putin is thinking is lying. Nobody knows what he's thinking. Even the people around him don't know what he's thinking. This is the nature of many of these kind of governments, is that because he's been in power so long, he doesn't necessarily need this kind of collegiate decision-making apparatus. Everything comes from him. But what I think has been clear over the past year is, just as I alluded to before, that this war is other than the technology that we see. It is no different than any of the kind of wars that Russia has fought in the past, be them, and most of them have been, imperialistic wars where they've gone out to, either attack their neighbors to gain territory or just, to impose their will on them. It's exactly the same kind of pattern. Once they've attacked an area, there is generally a depopulation of that area where either the local inhabitants are taken back into Russia or scattered around, and then Russians brought in. Russia becomes the dominant language, Russian culture becomes the dominant culture, and by that way the place becomes Russified. It becomes part of Russia, the Russian world, and then it kind of assimilates with Russia. So it either becomes part of the Russian Empire back in the old days, or becomes part of the Soviet Union in the old days, or becomes part of the Soviet bloc in the old days. There's nothing we're seeing in this war, in the general side of things, that hasn't happened before, which is why what's happening now is quite predictable, in that, as as I said, when you absorb these territories and then you declare them to be part of Russia, it is exactly what Russia has done, from the Caucasus, in Chechnya, in Dagestan, in Ukraine itself, when it used to be Ukraine, in Belarus, in Poland, all these countries. We've alluded to the Second World War. The Second World War started when Nazi Germany invaded Poland. Of course, the secondary part of that is that the Soviet Union at that point then invaded Poland as well and took half of it, and they shared it between themselves, and it became part of the Soviet Union. All of this is kind of lost in the mythology of the Second World War, but as I said, this is there was a fairly consistent pattern in the Russian way of war. Whether it descends down to the horrors of the Second World War, I don't think so. I think this war is terrible enough in terms of the suffering of the people and the way the war is being prosecuted, but I don't think we're going to get to the point of concentration camps and gulags. Well, I really hope we don't. I think, that the Russian way of war is quite brutal, but and there is a chauvinistic superiority kind of ideology going around as dismissing the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian culture. But still, at the end of the day, they're Slavs, they're Slavic people, and they are essentially one people. This is like, people in, I don't know how to, think of a Nigerian analogy. It's like people from Ondo State fighting people from Ogun State. You're the same ethno-linguistic group, whatever, boundaries you have. So there are those limitations. So I wouldn't worry about it going as terrible as the Nazis' atrocities. But what I would say is that, looking at history, this war is in its brutality and its ferocity is not going to decrease up until one side is so sufficiently defeated that they agree to terms from the other.
Concerning mediation, Chidi, do you think that the China-Belarus talks calls for peace smack of sincerity?
No, no, they don't. And I mean, from an analyst point of view, the interesting part is that everybody knows that it's not sincere. The key element or the interesting element is that China will always be an interested party in this conflict. One of Russia's allies. They border Russia, and from a Russian point of view, their most significant threat is not actually NATO. Their most significant threat is China, because China is economically dominant and is militarily dominant and is on their border. And their army and their military is much stronger than the Russians. And more importantly, the part of Russia that borders China is quite depopulated. So even now you find just like in Africa, lots of Chinese have come across the border, are working, set up farms, set up businesses, and is slowly being assimilated. But at the same time, the Chinese are very much opposed to the West. They fear Western domination, and quite justifiably, if you look at Chinese history, they are very suspicious of Western intentions. We've got to understand that in China's past, the Western powers, literally went to war to China to force them to buy opium. So in Chinese history, this, their suspicion of the West is quite justified. So anything that keeps the West on its toes and keeps them out of the Indo-Pacific is beneficial to China. The converse of that is that anything that affects global trade is problematic to China. So they're trying to find this really difficult road where they can keep the West, off balance, and occupied with this war, but also maintain the global economy and not crash it, which, would have an adverse effect on them. But because of their role as a Western adversary and a Russia ally, they're unlikely to be able to bring up a reasonable peace deal. And the peace deal they brought up has been, was fairly ridiculous. It's essentially calling for a significant portion of Ukraine to be either left with the Russians or demilitarized to the point where the Russians could just walk in at any point. The Belarusians, again, are a little Russia. There's a very interesting, if we really wanted to get nerdy into it, there's a very interesting relationship between Lukashenko and Putin. Lukashenko is more or less like, I really hate using Nazi analogies because, it makes you think you're calling somebody a Nazi. But if we look back to the Second World War, the relationship between Mussolini of Italy and Hitler of Germany was very much like the Lukashenko-Putin relationship. While Mussolini was the old boy, the guy, the first, kind of fascist leader, he had the weaker state. Lukashenko his regime predates the Putin regime, and he's clearly much weaker, but their relationship is very dynamic. So he can run out and go out and say things on behalf of Putin without committing Putin to anything. And that is a kind of he can kind of raise a flag and say, wait, we could do this, we could do that, or he can make threats, that, they're going to attack from Belarus and all that kind of stuff without Russia having to commit itself. But any peace deal is not going to come from those two powers. The most likely power, if I make a prediction, which one should never do, would be a country like Turkey, or even from one of the Middle Eastern states. Turkey is the most important power in this war, as in it has good relations with both sides, it supplies weapons to both sides, trades with both sides, and controls access to the Black Sea, which is the key theater, key naval theater. Turkey right now is massively distracted by upcoming elections and also by this earthquake, so they're out of the picture for a while. But any peace deal is not going to come unless, again, this is a risky statement, but it's very unlikely to come from Belarus or from China.
The Mussolini comparison analogy understood. Imperfect, but understood. Thank you so much for your perspective. Very interesting and much food for thought. Mr. Chidu Nwanu, joining us from out of London. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us this morning.
Thank you.
After the break, Moscow says it will renew the grain deal if its interests are considered. Details in a moment. Please stay with us. Welcome back. U.S. State Department spokesperson Ned Price says Russia has given the U.S. an official diplomatic note on its withdrawal from the New START, a key nuclear arms reduction agreement. Mr. Price says Russia is not better off in a world where the two largest nuclear powers are no longer engaged in bilateral arms control, adding that Russia's willingness to promote instability, to promote irresponsible nuclear rhetoric, endanger every nation on this planet. Price says that the U.S. is still in compliance with the treaty, including the New START's numerical limits on nuclear weapons, but suggested that that could change depending on how Russia chooses to proceed. Ukrainians have reported attacks in the Belohorivka and Kremina areas in the eastern Luhansk region of Ukraine. Serhiy Haidai, head of the Luhansk Regional Military Administration, says, quote, there is constant shelling of our deoccupied settlements along the front line, despite the fact that there are many civilians in some settlements. The enemy is well aware of this, and still it shells with heavy caliber weapons. Now, for the past 2 months, the front lines close to the border of Luhansk and Kharkiv regions have seen heavy exchanges of fire, as well as fighting in the forest west of Kremina, which is held by the Russians. Now joining us is Associate Professor of International Relations, Dr. Dakwah Thomas. Dr. Dakwa Thomas joins us via Zoom from the Lagos State University. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, sir.
Thank you for having me.
How worried should we be about Russia, about the uranium capabilities enrichment by Iran, which has been spotted by the IAEA? I remember from the days of even before the presidency of Ronald Reagan and George Bush Sr. and George W. Bush, onto this current president, Joe Biden, and even way before that, Iran has always been the one that is looked to be dealt with carefully as far as nuclear power is concerned. Do you think that we should be worried? And what do you think should be done?
Well, of course, they have denied, and they have denied the report. And they are also looking, because we are talking of 85 being dangerous, and they are about 84.5 or something. Unfortunately, well, you can never expect them to tell the truth, particularly all these nations. None of them will tell you the truth about their nuclear capability. But it's been on and off. You can see that at a particular point in time, Obama had to give some concession, some monetary inducement and everything to them to stop this uranium development and everything, But I know that as far as Israel is concerned, is going to be very dangerous for the Israelis will see it as a kind of existential threat should Iran now develop its own nuclear capability. And for as long as Israel keeps monitoring the activities of Iran concerning nuclear development and everything, the more we have continued crisis in the Middle East. Unfortunately for Iran, I don't see a win situation for them in this kind of in the whole process. I believe that Israel has the capability to either stop them, but the US has been preventing them from taking any action or from doing any strike against Iran. But we should feel concerned. Naturally, every nation should feel concerned when nations start developing nuclear capabilities all the time, particularly considering the fact that most nations have already signed the Non-Proliferation Act Treaty, Non-Nuclear Proliferation Treaty Act, 1967, and they do not expect any kind of violation of this. So that's why the US has been trying to stop North Korea and Iran. So, but there is nothing they can do particularly for North Korea, because they won't allow visitation of any US inspection team.
Of course.
So the same thing with Iran. Iran is still expecting. Yes, Iran is still expecting that the US be talking about monetary inducement of monetary value. Unfortunately, nothing has happened like that. Being some kind of development unknown to the world. But there is nothing that can be unknown now in view of the kind of satellites that they have all over the globe.
Of course, Donald Trump put a stop to that from the Obama policy of being, well, according to some people, handling the situation with Iran with kid gloves. But we're asking this context, of course, we're asking this question rather in the context of Iran being a de facto ally of Russia. And speaking of allies of Russia and the people who are trying to bring this war to an end, and countries such as Belarus and China, I posed the question to our last guest, and China is saying that they want the war to come to an end. Our last guest says that they're not sincere. What are your thoughts?
It's unfortunate that China fails to see the opportunities involved in this scenario for its own development or to its own advantage. And I have always believed the maxim in international relations that you talk of permanent interests, not permanent enemies. So there are so many opportunities left for China now. You are since 2014, I believe, yes, since 2014, you have become the strongest economy in the world. And for a very long time, you have been concentrating on your economy. Unfortunately, now you have an opportunity to intervene, to intervene in the crisis without necessarily disrupting your own economic program. But you want to plunge yourself into a war that will definitely have devastating effect on your economy. And then you come back to your former level, and which is unfortunate. Because two things that China can do. One, either tell Russia to withdraw and maintain the status quo. Yes, even if you are not asking them to go back to the 2014 scenario, where you are only talking of Sevastopol and Crimea. But when Russia has now annexed 4, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and the Donbass, it becomes very difficult for negotiation to commence from that level, just like Chidi said. It becomes very difficult for negotiation to commence on the level where you have already taken about 4 territories again, four regions again from Ukraine, and no nation will come to the negotiation table with that kind of setting. Why? The second reason is that China has the opportunity, because it may get to that level. 2 scenarios may happen. One, it's either this war develop or escalates into what you call, just like you asked, Third World War. One, but God forbid, it is also a possibility that at the end of the day, US may mute the idea, because Blinken has already said it before. I have been an advocate of this particular scenario. Blinken has already said it before, that let us remove Russia from Security Council. So it's an opportunity for China, because at the end of the day, if there is going to be a redrawing of structure in terms of new manipulations and everything, and you put everything into vote, definitely France, Britain, and US will come together. And that is the end of veto. That is the end of veto. It's not there. I have said this so many times that there is nothing sacrosanct about veto. He that giveth can take it. So if they say there is no need for it, yes, this is international system. It is very complex. Either it is very complex and anarchical. So in every kind of situation, the Chinese have failed to be able to preempt what actions the US can take. And when you study US very well, from the arrogant posturing which they have been speaking from, you will know that they have something up their sleeves. And it is unfortunate that China has failed to read this. Because number one, once your economy crashes, it's going to be very difficult for you, because it took you so many years to build this. So I don't know why they want to put their economy in jeopardy, because yes, you may not see the effect of these sanctions and all sorts of things, all the sanctions placed on Russia. But I know that in the next 10 years, Russia will never be the same again, because they are going to go down the lane, and it's going to be very tough. So if China if China wants to do this, if China wants to preserve its own economic status now, the best thing, even if you don't want to talk about veto, just tell Russia to withdraw. And once China makes that pronouncement, Russia becomes jittery, because that's the only power it relies on. That's the only member of Security Council that it relies on. So whichever way the pendulum swings for China will determine the situation, will determine the war. So and US can determine the war, and they will just come up with that idea.
Dr. Thomas,
and that is the end. Once they remove the veto, that will be the end. There is nothing that will remove veto for any yes.
Okay, Dr. Thomas. Yes, we're here. We can hear you loud and clear. We apologize for the glitch for our viewers in his audio just now. But Dr. Thomas, now going forward, it's been over a year now since this unfortunate conflict began, and my heart bleeds, and I know our collective hearts bleed for those that have lost their lives in this invasion. But as I said to my earlier guest, what do you make of Putin's overall plan and motive? I said to him, I said, people had drawn comparisons to the Third World War, God forbid, Adolf Hitler, God forbid. Does Putin have any such tendencies? Surely he can't be that bad to want to not de-escalate the war and bring this thing to an end. People argue that he's old school.
Yeah. Yes, he has some psychological problems. He has always believed that the US, that either Russia is superior to the US or the US should not claim superiority. So that's a psychological problem for him. That's number one. Number two, he believes that because Russia is a world power, so it can do and undo, possibly because of his nuclear capability or because of his veto power, that nothing can happen. And then number three, he is an arrogant fellow. He's so proud. He's an arrogant fellow. So when you are dealing with such people, you need to be very careful. One, and again, just like Chizi said, the Russians never have any strategic. They don't never have any strategic when it comes. Tactics when it comes to warfare. They only believe because aggression does not have any agenda than annexation. So when annexation becomes the only aim or goal of your war, then it's going to be very brutal. And then when it becomes brutal, you become reckless. And when you become reckless, then you don't have any, there is nothing anybody can tell that will make you to withdraw until you achieve your goal. So for now, because if there's anything that Putin is pursuing in Ukraine, it should be clearly stated, but there is nothing. And what has given him this kind of consent was the fact that in 2014, when he annexed Crimea, which was given, originally it belonged to Ukraine, came back to Russia, handed over as a compensation by Khrushchev in 1954 for what Stalin did to the Ukrainians when, during what we call Holodomor, between 1932 and 1933. So these are issues that ordinarily nobody should go to. Putin should not have gone to Ukraine again, but to have commenced war again in 2014 and 2022 shows that Putin has some kind of empire mentality. He was definitely not happy with the fall of the Soviet Union. And as a result of that, he has not made that kind of pronouncement, but I haven't studied him and I haven't read so much about it. I want to believe that he has hidden his agenda. And that is why you keep seeing him coming as president, coming as prime minister, coming as president, taking over again, And at the end of the day, he has now become the president and he sees the opportunity for a kind of, you want to call it revenge, what kind of revenge? A kind of opportunity for him to recover what Khrushchev has given, to the Ukrainians in 1954. That is Crimea. Yes, Crimea may be strategic to Russia, but it's also strategic to Ukraine.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Yet Russia claims its interests are purely nationalist and patriotic, especially Putin. Thank you so much for your thoughts and your shedding light as far as what you make of this issue is concerned. Dr. Dakwa Thomas, the Lagos State University International Relations Associate Professor of International Relations. Thank you for coming on the program this morning.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Coming up, Russians are loving the Big Mac replacement. Do join us again. Welcome back. A tentative agreement between Serbia and Kosovo concerning this just now were to normalize relations marks a quiet victory for the West as it vies with Russia for influence in Belgrade. Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine a year ago, pro-Moscow sentiment has spilled into Serbia's streets. T-shirts with the letter Z, a symbol of Russia's campaign, are sold as souvenirs, while a far-right group openly touts support for Russia. The president, Alexander Vucic, trying to pull off a tricky balancing act between Serbia's deep cultural and religious ties with Russia on the one hand and European Union ambitions and a NATO partnership on the other, has done little to counter the agitation out of fear of losing popular support. But behind the pro-Russian street rallies, the West is making inconspicuous strides to expand trade ties with Serbia, reduce its reliance on Russian energy, and defuse tensions with Kosovo, its former, mainly ethnic Albanian southern province. Loath to alienate the EU, Belgrade has condemned Russia's invasion at the United Nations and other global fora, recognized Ukraine's pre-war borders, sent humanitarian and infrastructural aid to Kyiv, and welcomed refugees from the conflict, both Ukrainians and Russians. A quiet shift is also underway in the energy sector. Serbia has long relied almost entirely on cheap Russian gas, while its main oil producer is owned by Russia, Gazprom and Gazpromet. Last year, however, Serbia stopped importing Russian crude oil in line with EU sanctions, switching mainly to Iraqi supplies, and it's working with Bulgaria on the construction of a gas pipeline that will carry natural and liquefied gas from Greece and Turkey. And joining us for the business perspective of things is Laddie Williams, our business correspondent. Laddie, good morning to you. Good morning. It's been over a year of this very unfortunate and damaging conflict that has led to the loss of lives and property and in Ukraine, and involvement from countries around the world.
Yeah, everyone has felt it. You know, it's been an incredible global economic impact. Right now, we've seen, you know, economies hit new records, you know, when it comes to inflation. We've seen commodity prices skyrocket, from oil hit a new high, a level not seen in many years. And we've also seen grain prices also, you know, hit new highs. Energy prices, we've seen that's been the bone in Europe for a while now. We've seen Europe struggle with, you know, rising prices due to, you know, rising gas prices. So all of this, we've seen, you know, commodities, inflation, everything hitting new highs, and rate hikes too. We've seen central bankers have to take rates to record levels not seen in a while, and with the U.S. still having their 2% target, it's looking like they're still really far away from it, and it looks like they're still going to be raising rates to actually get there. So at the end of the day, the world has felt the impact. We're still feeling it, even though we've seen risk assets too. They've been hit hard. We've seen the U.S. dollar, that's rallied, hit a new high of 114 points. That was in 2022. Well, we've seen all those prices kind of, you know, taper down in 2023. But now the question is, what happens next? You know, the war is still on. Do we see those prices start to inch up? That's the question, and we still have the drums of recession still sounding loud globally at this time.
And you may not have the answer to that question, because it depends on if the war continues. God forbid it shall stop today, but not to talk of for another year. Yeah. But how about Russia giving conditions for its grain deal?
Yeah, so everyone has been, you know, on the edge regarding that grain deal. We saw how, you know, the impact of the war, you know, hit the grain markets. We saw grain prices rise. Countries that depend heavily on those grain exports, they suffered. Countries in the Middle East, you know, even Nigeria here, we import wheat, and we also felt, you know, the impact of that. But at the end of the day, the deal is still on, but there's a renewal that's supposed to come sometime in March. I think that's about 18th or so. They're supposed to renew the deal, but now Russia, they have parts of that deal they're not happy with. Okay. And they're saying that if their interest is not looked into for this deal, they might not renew it. And we know what that means for
scarcity.
The global food markets. Scarcity, prices going to go up.
And obviously, there's still that risk of hunger. So at the end of the day, Russian commodities are not targeted, but, you know, we've seen logistics, their payment systems being targeted at this time because of the sanctions. So they're saying, you know what, if you want us to renew this deal, you need to cut us some slack too, so that we can actually gain something, you know, from the deal. So that's where we are now. So it's everyone is just watching now at this time to make sure that we don't have some kind of global food crisis, you know, going forward. But hopefully they renew the deal.
Hopefully that happens.
Fingers crossed at this point.
Thank you so much, Ladi. Our business correspondent, Ladi Williams, who you can join after this program for Business Morning for business news across the board. Finally, the signature sauce has changed and the ingredients have been tweaked. But the big hit, which went on sale in Russia this week, is a tasty alternative to the McDonald's Big Mac in its replacement. That's according to several customers who are now enjoying what they call a tasty treat. McDonald's closed its Russian restaurant soon after Moscow sent tens of thousands of troops into Ukraine last February, eventually selling to a local licensee, Alexander Govor, who unveiled the new brand in June. That deal imposed restrictions on the color scheme and products that the successor chain or Tasty, and that's what it can use. Now, Big Macs, McFlurries, and the Golden Arches were all a go, as was the McDonald's-style Big Mac, if you're familiar with it, the Big Mac sauce. And that's where we leave it for our renewed coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's official. Please join us every morning as we take you down the road of this special coverage. Thank you so much for watching today, and we look forward for you to being with us every morning. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Have a good day.